can't marry you. My parents chose someone else," the millionaire said. 2 years later, he saw her with triplets and begged to hold them. The late afternoon settled softly inside the bookstore cafe, warm light spilling through tall windows and laying gentle squares across the wooden floor. Shelves of well-worn books climbed toward the ceiling, their pages carrying the quiet promise of countless untold stories. The air held a blend of freshly ground coffee, paper, and something calm that made footsteps slow without anyone realizing why. A small brass bell above the door hung still, as if it were catching its breath. Outside, the river moved at its own steady pace, but inside, time felt gentler. Laughter drifted faintly from a corner table, mixed with the low murmur of a few customers lost in their own thoughts. Behind the counter, polished wood gleamed beneath hanging lights, cups rested in neat rows, and a simple vase of fresh flowers added a touch of life to the scene. Everything in the space spoke of care, not luxury, not show, just intention and warmth. It was here, in this quiet haven by the river, that the story stood frozen in a moment 2 years after everything had changed. He sat near the window, at a round table just large enough for two but occupied by one. His coat rested over the back of his chair, expensive, tailored, yet somehow out of place in this humble room. A porcelain cup sat before him, untouched now, a thin ring of coffee marking where his lips had been moments earlier. Alex's posture was careful, almost restrained. His back was straight, the way it had been trained to be in boardrooms and public appearances, but his shoulders carried a softness that didn't belong to those spaces. His fingers wrapped loosely around the handle of the cup, then released, then returned again, as if he couldn't decide what to do with himself. Outside the glass, the river slid past in a ribbon of fading light. Inside, Alex's reflection hovered faintly beside him, doubling his image, the powerful man the world recognized, and the quieter one few ever saw. Around him, the cafe moved gently, pages turning, a chair scraping lightly, a child's laugh, the hiss of steamed milk. None of it reached him in a rush. It touched him instead like a steady pulse, something grounding. His gaze drifted from the window to the small stack of picture books left at the edge of the table, then to the counter beyond. He didn't look impatient. He didn't look curious in the usual way. He looked suspended, as though this single seat, in this single moment, was the only place he truly existed. For the first time in a long while, Alex was not preparing, not performing, not proving. He was simply sitting, breathing and waiting, though he could not have said for what. The child rested against him as naturally as if this had always been their place together. Small fingers curled loosely into the fabric of his sleeve, then relaxed again, as if testing whether it was safe to stay. The boy's head leaned gently toward Alex's chest, dark lashes brushing his cheek in slow, unhurried blinks. Alex shifted only once, carefully, to support the child's back, his arm forming a steady cradle without stiffness or hesitation. The boy made a soft, content sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, and tucked himself closer, as though the world outside this moment no longer existed. Sunlight slid across the table and caught in the child's hair, turning it into a quiet halo of gold. Tiny sneakers dangled just above the floor, kicking lazily once before going still. A coloring book lay open beside them, bright scribbles spilling beyond the lines, forgotten for now. For a man accustomed to precision and control, this closeness felt almost foreign, and yet perfectly right. There was no calculation in the child's trust, no awareness of titles, wealth, or reputation. There was only warmth, breath, and the simple fact of being held. A faint tremor passed through Alex's arm. Not fear exactly, but something deeper, the weight of how fragile this life felt, how real, how impossible to replace. And in that small, ordinary exchange, a man and a child sharing a chair, the room seemed to quiet around them, as if even the cafe understood that something important was happening in silence. Up close, the tremor was almost invisible, a small uneven flutter that traveled through his fingers and then stilled, only to return a heartbeat later. His grip never tightened, yet it wasn't entirely steady either, as though his body was struggling to balance control with feeling. His thumb hovered just above the child's back, pausing before settling again in a slow, careful stroke. The motion was gentle, unpracticed, but deeply sincere. Each breath he took seemed measured, as if he were afraid that even breathing too hard might disturb the moment. The porcelain cup beside him rattled faintly against its saucer when his elbow brushed the table, a soft sound that sliced through the cafe's calm. Alex froze for an instant, eyes flicking down, then back to the child in his arms, relieved when the boy didn't stir. A thin line appeared between his brows, not from strain, but from the effort of holding himself together. In meetings, in negotiations, in rooms filled with power, his hands had never betrayed him. Here, with a small life resting against his chest, they refused to obey that same discipline. The tremor wasn't weakness, it was recognition, the kind that arrives too quietly to shout but too strongly to ignore. From behind the counter, Maya remained still, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the polished wood. The hum of the cafe moved around her, cups clinking, pages turning, low conversation, yet her focus stayed fixed on the table by the window. She did not lean forward. She did not stare. Her attention was steady in the way of someone accustomed to observing without intruding. Light from the window brushed across her profile, softening her expression. The years had added composure to her face, not hardness, a quiet assurance that came from having carried responsibility, sleepless nights, and tender joys in equal measure. A customer spoke to her from the other side of the counter, and she turned just enough to respond, her voice calm and courteous. Then, almost instinctively, her gaze returned to Alex and the child in his arms. Her fingers lingered over a cup she had just dried, tracing its rim without realizing it. For a brief moment her expression shifted, not regret, not bitterness, something quieter, more layered, something held rather than revealed. She watched the way Alex adjusted his arm, the way he breathed, the way his attention narrowed entirely to the small boy against his chest. She took in the scene as one might take in a memory that had once been painful but had softened with time. A faint, almost imperceptible breath left her lips. Then she placed the cup back on the shelf with deliberate care, straightened slightly, and returned to her work, still aware of him but no longer unsettled by his presence. Somewhere near the door, the small brass bell seemed to linger in the air long after it had sounded, not loud, just present, like the fading note of a piano key that no one had quite let go of. It hovered between moments, threading through the low murmur of voices, the hiss of milk, the shuffle of pages. To anyone else, it was nothing more than the memory of a sound. To Alex, it felt like the line that connected his past to this very second. The bell had chimed when he stepped inside, uncertain, unsettled, drawn by something he couldn't name. That brief, gentle ring had announced his arrival without fanfare. It had marked the exact instant his life tilted in a new direction. Now, as the echo dissolved into the cafe's quiet rhythm, it carried with it the weight of everything that had brought him here. Meetings ended, decisions made, choices lived with, roads taken and abandoned. Outside, the river kept moving. Inside, the room held its breath just a little longer. The bell settled. The moment remained. The thought arrived like a single clean strike rather than a speech. A man who could sign away fortunes without hesitation now found his hands betraying him over something that fit entirely in his palm. In conference rooms, his signature had closed skyscraper deals, shifted markets, and moved armies of lawyers with a flick of ink. People had watched those same hands glide calmly across contracts worth more than entire neighborhoods, never once seeing them waver. Cameras had captured them steady, composed, unshakable. Here, none of that mattered. There were no shareholders, no headlines, no polished glass tables between him and consequence. There was only a small body breathing against his chest, and that was enough to undo every layer of certainty he had spent years building. His reputation suggested control. This moment exposed something different. Power had taught him to command rooms. This child forced him to feel. The contrast was sharp, undeniable, and deeply human. For the first time, his success offered him no armor. The cafe hummed on, but Alex's stillness made the room feel narrower, more intimate, as if the world had quietly leaned closer to watch. And in that space between his breath and the child's, a few quiet questions seemed to hover, not spoken aloud, not lectured, just felt. Had he ever paused like this before, without a schedule pressing at his back? Had he ever held something so small that it made every measure of success feel strangely thin? How many people, somewhere in their own lives, had stood at the edge of a moment like this, realizing too late that the most valuable things cannot be negotiated, purchased, or postponed? How many had told themselves they were doing the responsible thing, only to discover later that responsibility had cost them something irreplaceable? The questions didn't accuse. They didn't chase him. They simply existed, drifting through the quiet air the way the river drifted past the windows, steady, unavoidable, and impossible to ignore. The truth sat quietly in the space between him and the child, needing no announcement. He had not been pushed onto this path at gunpoint. No one had dragged him from that cafe 2 years ago. He had walked away on his own, measured steps, polished excuses, and a carefully controlled expression that convinced the world he was doing what had to be done. He had chosen order over warmth, duty over desire, legacy over the woman who had seen him without his title. He had dressed fear up as responsibility and called it maturity. Now, in this sunlit room, none of those arguments carried weight. The child's steady breathing cut straight through every justification he had rehearsed. There was no strategy here, no family charter to consult, no board to impress, only the unmistakable realization that choices leave fingerprints. He had gained what he was meant to gain: power, prestige, applause. And yet, sitting at this small table with a tiny heartbeat against his chest, it was impossible to ignore what had slipped beyond his reach. The cost of his decision was not abstract anymore. It was right in front of him, calm, breathing, and entirely real. The sunlight slipped across the table and climbed slowly up the wall, as if measuring the passage of something larger than time. Alex remained still, the child warm against him, the cafe breathing quietly around them. For a brief second, everything felt complete, as though this single image could stand on its own, a powerful man, a small child, a gentle room by the river. Yet beneath that stillness ran another current, quieter but stronger. This scene, tender as it was, did not exist in isolation. It was the end of a long path, not its starting point. The memory of another rainy night hovered just beyond the edge of the present. A different cafe, a different silence, a different choice. The sound of footsteps on wet pavement, the glow of street lamps over dark water, the weight of words left unsaid. The child shifted slightly in his arms, bringing him back to the present, but the past lingered close, patient, waiting. Because this moment, as raw, as fragile, as undeniable as it felt, had roots that stretched far beyond this sunlit room. It began somewhere else, in another rain with another conversation, and a decision that had changed everything. A quiet pause settled over the scene, not empty, just deliberate, like a breath before a story truly begins. The cafe continued around them, steady and unhurried, but the moment at the table held its own gravity. If you're already feeling pulled into this story, if this image of a powerful man changed by something small is holding your attention, stay with it. There is more beneath the surface, more emotion ahead, and more truth waiting to be uncovered. A simple gesture helps stories like this reach others who need them. A like if this moment caught you, a comment if it stirred something in you, and a subscription if you want to walk through stories that speak to the heart as much as the mind. For now, keep your eyes on this table, this child, and this man, because everything you're about to hear flows from here. Rain moved across the river in thin, restless threads, breaking the surface into countless trembling fragments of light. Each drop landed without hurry, creating ripples that widened, touched, and faded before being replaced by the next. From the bridge in the distance, headlights drifted like slow-moving stars, their reflections stretching and bending across the water. Street lamps along the bank glowed in muted halos, their yellow shimmer smeared softly by the falling rain. The river did not rage or rush. It carried itself with steady patience, as though accustomed to holding stories no one ever spoke aloud. Occasional gusts of wind skimmed its surface, lifting faint shivers that traveled outward until they dissolved into stillness again. Along the shoreline, wet pavement gleamed like dark glass. Trees bowed slightly beneath the drizzle, their leaves gathering droplets that slipped free one by one, tapping quietly against the ground. Somewhere nearby, a boat drifted past, its outline blurred by the rain, its wake whispering against the water before disappearing. The city existed beyond the river, but here, in this stretch of evening, everything felt slowed, softened, held in a breath that had yet to be released. It was a kind of rain that invited quiet, the sort that made people pause, look out a window, and let their thoughts drift farther than they intended. Set just a few steps back from the river, the cafe sat tucked between taller, quieter buildings, as if it preferred not to be noticed unless someone truly needed it. Warm light spilled from its wide front windows, spilling across the wet pavement in soft amber patches that wavered with every passing car. Inside, the space felt lived in rather than designed, wooden tables bearing small nicks and scratches, chairs that didn't quite match, but belonged together anyway, and shelves lined with mismatched mugs that looked like they had been chosen slowly, not purchased in bulk. The counter stretched along one side of the room, polished smooth by years of use. Above it hung a few simple pendant lights that glowed gently, bright enough to see clearly, soft enough to make everything feel calmer. Behind the counter, glass jars of sugar, coffee beans, and baked goods sat neatly arranged, catching the light in quiet glimmers. A chalkboard menu leaned against the wall, its lettering uneven but careful, written by someone who cared more about sincerity than perfection. Near the back, a small bookshelf held paperbacks and dog-eared novels, inviting customers to linger longer than they had planned. There was no pretension here, no attempt to impress, no glossy modern aesthetic, no feeling of being watched. The room wrapped around visitors instead, welcoming them without fanfare, like a place that understood the comfort of staying a while. Even the air seemed gentler, carrying the steady rhythm of cups being set down, pages turning, and low voices blending together into a soothing background hum. Maya moved with an unhurried rhythm, as if the room naturally followed her pace rather than the other way around. Her apron hung neatly at her waist, tied in a simple bow, its fabric softened by countless washes. She wiped the counter in smooth, even strokes, pausing only when a cup needed adjusting or a saucer required straightening. Nothing about her felt rushed, yet nothing felt slow either. just precise in a quiet, practiced way. When a customer spoke, she turned her head just enough to listen fully, not halfway, not distracted. Her responses were brief but warm, her voice low and steady, the kind that made people feel heard without being interrogated. Her hands worked almost instinctively, grinding beans, steaming milk, setting a small plate of bread beside a waiting coffee. Each movement carried care, not performance, as though every drink and every interaction deserved the same respect. A strand of hair slipped loose near her temple. She tucked it back without breaking her focus, eyes already scanning the counter for the next small task that needed attention. Behind her, the espresso machine hissed softly. She tapped the portafilter once, twice, then locked it into place with a gentle twist. The familiar sound seemed to anchor her, steady and reliable. She wasn't trying to be noticed. She simply existed in the space with quiet presence, the kind that made a room feel calmer just because she was there. The door opened with a soft push, letting in a thin ribbon of cool, damp air before closing again behind him. Alex stepped inside slowly, as if the threshold itself required effort. Rain clung to the shoulders of his dark coat, tiny beads gathering at the seams before slipping downward. His hair, usually immaculate, carried the faint disorder of weather and weariness. He paused just inside the doorway, eyes briefly taking in the room without really seeing it. His gaze skimmed the tables, the counter, the warm glow of the lights, not with curiosity, but with the distant habit of someone used to scanning spaces out of instinct. His face held no sharp expression, no clear emotion. Instead, there was a kind of quiet heaviness in his features, the slight tightening of his jaw, the faint shadow beneath his eyes, the tired set of his mouth. He loosened his tie with 2 careful fingers, just enough to breathe, then let his hand fall back to his side. The movement was small, almost private, as though he had forgotten he was no longer alone. For a moment he simply stood there, caught between leaving and staying. Then, with a measured exhale, he took a few steps forward. The soles of his shoes made barely a sound against the wooden floor, as if even his footsteps were conserving energy. He didn't greet anyone. He didn't search for recognition. He just drifted toward the nearest empty table by the window, not chosen exactly, but reached by instinct. Outside, rain continued to trace its slow paths down the glass. Inside, Alex carried that same quiet stillness with him as he lowered himself into the chair, shoulders finally relaxing by a fraction. Maya finished placing a cup on the shelf, then lifted her eyes toward the window table almost by instinct. Alex sat with his back to the room, shoulders still, gaze fixed somewhere beyond the glass. He looked less like a customer, and more like a man who had wandered in without knowing why. She dried her hands on a cloth, folded it once, and set it aside. Only then did she move toward him, not quickly, not hesitantly, just naturally, as though this were the most ordinary thing in the world. Her footsteps were light against the wooden floor. She stopped at the edge of his table, far enough to respect his space, close enough that he would know she was there. For a beat, she simply observed him. The way his fingers rested loosely on the cup handle, the way his jaw tightened and released, the way his breath carried the faintest edge of exhaustion. Then, softly, "Long day?" The question was simple, unremarkable, the kind 100 baristas ask every evening. But her tone wasn't routine. It carried no small talk, no hurry, only quiet attentiveness. Alex didn't look at her right away. His eyes stayed on the river for a moment longer, as if he were weighing whether to answer at all. When he finally turned, there was a flicker of surprise in his expression, not at her words, but at the calm steadiness in her face. His lips parted, then closed again. A breath escaped him, slow and uneven. "Long life," he said. The words slipped out before he seemed ready for them, honest in a way he hadn't intended. His voice was low, rough at the edges, carrying more weight than the 2 words should have held. Maya didn't react with shock. She didn't tilt her head in pity or offer an automatic comfort line. She simply met his gaze, holding it for a second longer than politeness required. Her expression remained steady, understanding without intrusion. For the first time since he walked in, Alex felt the tension in his shoulders loosen just a little. Maya held his gaze for a heartbeat, then let it soften without ever slipping into sympathy. She did not lean in, lower her voice, or offer any of the rehearsed comforts people usually give when someone admits too much. Instead, she treated his answer as something ordinary and real, not tragic, not shocking, just human. Her lips curved in the faintest, gentlest way, enough to show kindness without performing it. "I'll bring you something warmer," she said, as if the solution were simple and immediate. Her voice carried no judgment, no overfamiliarity, only calm assurance. She turned without waiting for his reply, moving back toward the counter with the same steady rhythm she always carried. Behind her, the espresso machine hissed softly as she prepared his drink. Alex watched her for a moment longer than he meant to. She didn't rush. She didn't look back at him out of curiosity. She simply worked, measuring, steaming, pouring, as though she trusted that he would still be there when she returned. When she came back, she placed a warm mug in front of him with quiet care, setting it just within his reach. Steam rose gently between them. "Sometimes people think better this way," she added, not as advice, just as fact. Then she stepped back, giving him space without making him feel abandoned. No pity, no probing, just presence, steady, uncomplicated, and unexpectedly grounding. The mug arrived with a quiet thud that felt more like a placement than a delivery. Thick ceramic, simple, unpretentious, the kind meant to be held rather than photographed. Steam rose in a thin, steady line, curling upward before fading into the air between them. The surface of the drink was dark and glossy, flecked with a light dusting of foam along the edge. A faint warmth reached his hands even before he touched it. Maya set a small napkin beside the cup, then slid the saucer a fraction closer, adjusting it without making the movement obvious. Her fingers brushed the table only for a second. Neat, precise, and unhurried. She didn't hover. She didn't watch for his reaction. She simply ensured everything was in place, as though the drink itself were part of a silent understanding. Alex's eyes dropped to the mug. He wrapped both hands around it, palms slowly absorbing the heat. The tension that had been sitting in his chest shifted, not dramatically, just enough to remind him he could breathe. Outside, rain traced narrow paths down the glass. Inside, warmth spread from his hands to his arms, then quietly through the rest of him. He lifted the cup just slightly, not yet to drink, just to feel its weight. And for the first time since walking in, the edge of his exhaustion softened rather than sharpened. He didn't look up right away after she set the mug down. Instead, he kept his hands wrapped around the heat, eyes lowered, breathing a little slower than before. The drink wasn't anything extravagant, just coffee. Yet the way it had been placed in front of him felt strangely intentional, as if someone had noticed him rather than simply served him. A subtle shift moved through his chest, unfamiliar and almost disarming. No one in his world spoke to him like that. No assistants asked how he felt. No executives cared whether he was tired. Even his parents measured him in performance, not presence. Here, none of that existed. Maya hadn't flattered him. She hadn't tried to impress him. She hadn't treated him like a man of status or power. She had simply treated him like a person. He lifted the cup at last, bringing it close, letting the steam brush his face before he took a slow sip. The warmth settled in him, steady and grounding, chasing away a little of the chill that had clung to him since he walked in. Across the room, he caught a reflection in the glass behind the counter, focused, calm, moving with quiet certainty, not watching him, not waiting for gratitude, not seeking anything from him. That realization landed gently but firmly. For the first time in a long while, Alex felt neither admired nor judged. The coffee cooled slowly between his hands, but Alex did not reach for his phone or glance at his watch. He remained at the table long after the first sip, eyes drifting back to the river, then to the room, then to the faint ring his cup had left on the saucer. The chair beneath him seemed to soften rather than press, as though it had accepted that he was not leaving anytime soon. Outside, traffic moved in distant, muted currents. Inside, time stretched into something quieter. He set the mug down, then lifted it again, more out of habit than need. His thumb traced the rim once, absently, before he rested his hands in his lap. A man at the next table stood to leave, chair scraping lightly against the floor. A couple laughed softly near the bookshelf. The hiss of milk and the low murmur of conversation filled the space. Alex absorbed it all without effort, as if the room were holding him rather than the other way around. He should have gone back to his evening, calls to return, meetings to prepare for, an empty apartment waiting with its polished silence. He knew this. Still, he stayed. His gaze slid once more toward the counter, catching only a glimpse of Maya's profile as she moved with steady ease behind it. Nothing about her invited him to linger, yet nothing urged him to leave either. So he remained where he was, cup cooling, rain falling, and the weight he had carried into the cafe easing just enough to make him forget for a moment that he was meant to be somewhere else. When Maya returned to his table, it wasn't with urgency or expectation, just timing. She approached in the same unhurried way, cloth folded neatly in her hand, eyes scanning the room with practiced awareness. Only when she reached him did her attention settle again. "Need anything else?" she asked, not hovering, not rehearsed. Alex glanced at his cup, then back at her. "No," he said. "A beat. Thank you." The word was simple, but his tone carried more weight than politeness. She gave a small nod, accepting it without ceremony, and turned to leave. Then, almost as an afterthought, she paused half a step away. "Rain's meant to lighten soon," she added, casual, as if they were two regulars trading idle observations, rather than strangers who had just met. He looked toward the window, following her remark, then back to her. "Does it ever really listen?" he asked, not trying to be clever, just speaking before filtering himself. A faint smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Not usually," she replied, already moving again. No awkwardness hung between them, no desperate attempt to fill silence. No performance on either side. Their words were few, their pauses easy, their presence uncomplicated. It felt less like a conversation and more like two people briefly crossing paths in the same quiet current. As Maya drifted back behind the counter, Alex found himself watching her for a moment, not in curiosity or interest, but in a subtle, unfamiliar comfort. Nothing dramatic had happened, and somehow, that was exactly why it felt real. The rain found its rhythm against the glass, not in bursts, but in patient, uneven beats. Tiny droplets gathered at the top of the window, hesitated, then slipped downward in thin, winding trails. Some merged with others, growing heavier before breaking apart again. Every so often, a larger drop struck with a soft, hollow tap, sending a faint vibration through the pane. From inside, the sound was muted, a gentle percussion that threaded itself through the cafe's quiet hum. It wasn't loud enough to demand attention, yet it never quite disappeared either, lingering like a steady heartbeat beneath everything else. Alex's gaze followed one particular droplet as it curved slowly toward the bottom of the glass, splitting at the last second into two smaller streams that raced each other downward. Behind him, cups clinked and voices murmured, but the rain kept its own steady tempo, constant, unhurried, and strangely grounding. For a moment, the world outside the window felt distant, while the small room, with its warmth, its light, and its quiet sounds, felt entirely self-contained. A thin veil of steam curled upward from Alex's mug, drifting in slow, lazy spirals before dissolving into the warm air above the table. The heat shimmered faintly, blurring the space between his hands and the cup for just a second, then settling again. Across the room, other cups sent up their own soft trails of warmth, some rising straight, some bending slightly with the movement of air from the espresso machine. The steam caught the light from the hanging lamps, turning briefly luminous before vanishing. When Alex lifted his mug again, the steam brushed his face, carrying with it the deep, earthy scent of coffee. His breath met it halfway, mixing for a moment before both disappeared. Behind the counter, another cup was set down with a quiet click, and fresh steam began its slow climb. It felt like an unspoken rhythm, pour, rise, fade, repeated gently without hurry. Nothing about it was dramatic, but in that steady rising and vanishing, the cafe breathed, alive and constant, wrapping Alex in a warmth that felt quieter than comfort, yet just as real. Low voices drifted through the room in overlapping layers, never sharp enough to cut through the calm, never quiet enough to disappear. A woman near the bookshelf spoke in a gentle tone as she turned a page, her words blending with the soft scrape of a chair being adjusted. Two friends at a corner table laughed quietly, their conversation rising and falling like a tide that never rushed. Behind Alex, someone thanked Maya for their drink, the sound warm and brief. A child whispered to their parent, then giggled, quickly hushed with a playful finger to their lips. Cutlery touched porcelain, cups were set down, and every small sound seemed to arrive at just the right volume. None of it felt chaotic. None of it felt empty. Instead, the cafe carried a steady human rhythm, the kind of background life that makes a place feel lived in rather than staged. Alex didn't track any single voice. He let them pass through him like distant music, shaping the atmosphere without demanding his attention. In that soft murmur, he wasn't the center of anything. He was simply another person in a room full of quiet, ordinary moments, and, for once, that felt like exactly where he needed to be. When he first arrived, Alex had carried himself like a man enclosed in glass, present, yet sealed off, aware of everything but truly part of nothing. His shoulders had been tight, his movements careful, his gaze distant. Even sitting at the table, he'd seemed slightly removed from the room around him, as if he were temporarily visiting a world that wasn't meant for him. Now that separation had softened. His back still held its straight, composed line, but the rigid edge beneath it had loosened. His hands no longer hovered stiffly over the cup, they rested naturally on the table, fingers relaxed, weight evenly distributed. Where his eyes once skimmed past the room, they now lingered, briefly taking in the warm lights, the shelves of books, the slow movements behind the counter. Not searching, simply absorbing. At first, the chair had looked too small for him, too ordinary for a man used to leather and polished glass. Now, he sat into it rather than on top of it, his posture settling rather than resisting. The silence around him had once felt heavy, almost isolating. Now it felt steady, even welcoming. Nothing about him had changed dramatically, no sudden smile, no visible transformation. Yet the difference was clear in the subtleties, in his breath, in his hands, in the way his presence no longer pressed against the room but blended quietly into it. He was still alone at the table, but he no longer looked like a man trapped inside his own distance. He did not announce it, schedule it, or analyze it. He simply came back. At first, it was a few evenings a week, slipping in just before dusk as the sky thinned into pale gray. Sometimes he arrived with rain still clinging to his coat. Other times the air was dry, but his expression carried the same quiet weight. He never chose the same table deliberately, yet he often ended up by the window. His presence became a familiar shape in the room, tall, composed, deliberately unremarkable in a place that did not care about status. Some nights he arrived alone. Other nights, he stepped inside mid-call, then ended it the moment the door closed behind him, as if crossing the threshold made whatever waited outside less urgent. He didn't linger by the counter or try to make conversation immediately. He would simply sit, place his hands on the table and exhale, a small release that no one else might have noticed, but that slowly became part of his rhythm. Maya never treated his return like a victory, a habit, or a favor. She served him with the same steady calm as every other customer, yet there was an unspoken ease between them that grew with each visit. Sometimes he stayed only long enough for one drink. Other evenings stretched far past what he had planned, the cafe lights reflecting softly in the darkening window while the city outside moved on without him. There was no grand reason he could point to, no dramatic turning point, just a quiet pull that kept bringing him back, again and again and again. Over time, the room began to feel less like a stop on his way somewhere and more like a place he arrived at on purpose. Outside its doors, his world moved at a demanding pace. Meetings stacked back to back, voices competing for his attention, obligations pressing from every direction. Inside, that urgency lost its grip the moment the bell chimed and the door closed behind him. He didn't speak about this. He didn't need to. It showed in small ways. He loosened his tie sooner. He let his coat hang a little longer over the back of his chair. His phone, once kept constantly within reach, started resting face down on the table, forgotten more often than not. The cafe never changed to accommodate him, and that was exactly why it worked. No special treatment, no reverent silence, no one stepping aside because of his name. Life simply continued at its gentle, ordinary pace around him. On difficult evenings he arrived earlier. On heavier nights he stayed later. Sometimes he stared out at the river for long stretches without speaking to anyone. Other times he listened to the low murmur of voices or the soft hiss of the espresso machine, letting the sounds wash over him like steady breathing. It was steadiness. In a life where every space demanded something from him, this was the one place that asked for nothing. The warmth of the lights, the scent of coffee, the quiet movement of people, all of it wrapped around him without pressure. Gradually, the cafe stopped being just a location. It became the one place where he could simply exist, unguarded, unmeasured, and undeniably human. Their words, when they came, were never rushed into being. They slipped in between moments, light enough to be casual, grounded enough to feel real. At first, they spoke the way strangers do when they sensed they might one day become something more, carefully but not stiffly. One evening, as Alex turned a slim paperback he had found on the cafe's small shelf, Maya glanced over from behind the counter. "Good choice," she said, setting down a cup she had just finished drying. He looked up, surprised not by her speaking, but by how easy it felt that she had. "You've read it?" he asked. "Twice," she replied. The second time hurt more than the first. He tilted his head slightly. In a good way? She considered for a beat. In a true one. Another night the rain pressed harder against the windows, tapping a quicker rhythm. Alex watched it for a while before speaking. "It never sounds the same," he murmured. Maya followed his gaze. "Depends on how you're listening." He glanced at her then, really looked, and found no cleverness in her answer, only quiet sincerity. Sometimes they talked about the river instead. He wondered aloud where it went once it passed beyond the city. She told him she liked to imagine it carrying small secrets downstream, things people no longer needed to hold. He laughed softly at that, not mockingly, just unexpectedly, and the sound surprised them both. Their exchanges were never long, no grand confessions, no sweeping philosophies, just brief, steady threads woven naturally through the air between them. Books, weather, water, simple things. Yet with each small conversation, something subtle shifted. A little less distance, a little more ease, a little more recognition in the way their words met. Nothing dramatic happened, but something real quietly began. The simple talks did not disappear. They simply made room for something heavier, arriving without ceremony. One quiet evening, when the cafe had thinned to only a few tables, Alex lingered by the counter as Maya wiped down the surface between customers. His cup was empty, his coat still draped over his chair. "You ever wish," he said slowly, not quite looking at her, "that you could step out of your own life for a day?" She paused, cloth resting flat against the wood. "Out of it," she repeated softly, as if testing the shape of the words, or just away from the loud parts. He let out a low breath that wasn't quite a laugh. "Both," he admitted. Maya folded the cloth once before answering. "I think most people want that at some point," she said. "Not to disappear, just to breathe without being pulled." Another night, Alex sat by the window while rain traced thin lines down the glass. Maya brought him as usual without him asking. "My parents built everything I stand on," he said. "Sometimes I feel like I'm walking on their blueprint instead of my own feet." Maya set a small plate beside his cup, fingers stilling for just a second. "And how does that feel?" she asked. Not gently, not harshly, simply steady. Crowded, he replied at last. She didn't push. She didn't offer advice. She simply listened in a way that made his honesty feel safe rather than exposed. Later, when the cafe was nearly empty, she spoke about herself, not all at once, just fragments. How she had once imagined a different life, how she had learned that choices rarely arrive wrapped in certainty, how some days were hard, but real in a way she wouldn't trade. They never turned these moments into confessions or speeches. Their voices stayed low, their words sparse, their silences comfortable. With each exchange, the surface between them grew thinner, not broken, just more transparent. They began to see, without declaring it, that beneath small talk lay two people carrying different burdens, quietly recognizing each other in the weight of them. Most of what drew them together did not happen in speeches or declarations. It lived in still, ordinary spaces that other people might have overlooked. Some evenings, Alex arrived just as Maya was wiping the last tables before closing. He would take his usual seat by the window, not to talk, just to sit while she worked. She never asked him to leave early. He never made her feel rushed. There were nights when the cafe grew so calm that even the espresso machine seemed to breathe more softly. In those moments they exchanged only glances, brief, unspoken and easy, the kind that said, "I see you," without needing words. Once Alex dropped his spoon and it clinked lightly against the saucer. Maya reached for another almost instantly, placing it in front of him without looking directly at him, as if they had practiced the timing together for years. Another time, she burned her hand slightly on a steaming cup. He noticed before she reacted, sliding a small glass of cold water toward her from the counter without saying anything. She accepted it with a quiet nod. They never made these gestures bigger than they were. No apologies stretched too long. No gratitude turned into performance. Just quiet care passing back and forth in small, steady ways. On rainy nights, Alex would sit longer than usual, watching the water move outside while Maya moved behind the counter. On quieter evenings, she sometimes paused near his table for a few seconds longer than necessary. Not to talk, simply to exist in the same pocket of calm. Nothing exploded. Nothing announced itself. Their connection grew in pauses, shared air, and the kind of comfortable silence that only forms when two people feel safe enough not to fill it. And in those simple, unremarkable moments, something steady took root between them. Felt, not spoken, but undeniably present. One evening, the rain pressed harder against the windows than usual, thick and persistent, as if it had decided to stay. Alex sat at his usual table, both hands wrapped around his mug, eyes following the slow movement of water outside. Long, uneven lines formed on the glass, bending and merging before splitting again, each path different from the last. Inside, the cafe lights reflected faintly on the window, layering warm gold over the cooler darkness beyond. The glow softened everything, the river, the street, even Alex's own reflection, so that the world looked less harsh and more honest. Maya paused behind the counter, wiping the same spot she had already cleaned. She wasn't distracted, just aware in that quiet way she had. From where she stood, she could see the rain carving thin trails down the glass beside him, see his profile outlined against the dimming evening. He wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anything in particular. He simply watched. A drop gathered near the top of the pane, hesitated, then slid downward in one smooth, unbroken line. Halfway down, it met another, and they moved together, heavier now, more certain of their direction. Alex lifted his cup, took a slow sip, and set it back down without taking his eyes from the window. For a moment, nothing else existed. No city, no obligations, no expectations, only the steady movement of rain and the quiet warmth between them. Maya finished drying her cloth and folded it neatly, but she didn't move right away. She stayed where she was, sharing that stillness from across the room. No one spoke. They didn't need to. The rain had softened to a thin mist by the time the cafe grew quiet again. Only 2 other tables were occupied. A student bent over notes, and an older man slowly turning the pages of a newspaper. Alex leaned back slightly in his chair, one arm resting loosely along the back of it. His mug sat half empty, steam no longer rising from its surface. Maya stepped out from behind the counter to wipe a nearby table, moving close enough that conversation felt natural, not staged. Then Alex's gaze shifted from the window to her, measured, unhurried. "You know," he said, voice low, almost offhand, "I spend most of my days in rooms with very expensive ceilings." She glanced at him briefly, then continued drying the table. "Sounds uncomfortable," she replied, matter of fact. A faint exhale left him, not quite a laugh. "They are," he said. "Long tables, bright lights, people speaking at me instead of to me." She placed the cloth down and looked at him properly now. "And this?" she asked, nodding slightly toward the room around them. His eyes traveled across the cafe, the warm lights, the worn tables, the steady hum of quiet life, before returning to her. "I look forward to this place more than any boardroom," he admitted. The words were simple, but he did not say them lightly. There was no performance in his tone, no charm, no attempt to impress, just honesty, quiet and unguarded. Maya didn't react with flattery or surprise. She merely held his gaze for a beat, then offered the smallest of smiles, one that understood exactly what he meant. She picked up her cloth again. "Good," she said softly, already moving back toward the counter. Behind her, the espresso machine hissed gently. The rain whispered against the glass, and the room continued in its steady rhythm, as if his confession had simply slipped into the air and been accepted without fanfare. A few minutes later, she returned to his table with a fresh cloth folded neatly in her hand. Alex had turned his chair slightly toward the room now, no longer anchored entirely to the window. His posture looked easier, not relaxed exactly, but less guarded. Maya wiped the edge of the table closest to him, more out of habit than necessity. He watched her for a moment, then glanced down at his cup. "Careful," she said lightly, without looking up. He raised an eyebrow. "Careful about what?" She finally met his eyes, a faint spark of humor there. "Getting too attached to a small cafe by a river," she replied. "Terrible investment for a man like you." Her tone carried no bite, only gentle playfulness, the kind that felt natural between people who had grown comfortable in each other's presence. Alex let out a soft breath that almost became a laugh. "I wasn't aware my portfolio included emotional real estate," he said. She placed the cloth back on the counter behind her, then rested one hand lightly on the table between them. "Everything has a cost," she added, still teasing, still warm, even comfort. He studied her for a second longer than necessary, not defensively, not flirtatiously, just thoughtfully. For a brief moment the room felt smaller, closer, as if the space between them had quietly narrowed without either of them stepping forward. Maya straightened, already preparing to move on to the next table, but the easy tone between them lingered in the air like the fading warmth of his coffee. Alex rested his forearms lightly on the table, fingers still wrapped around his mug. He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted back to the window for a moment, to the river, to the fading light, to the gentle movement outside, then returned to her. A small, steady breath left him. "Then I suppose I've made worse choices," he said quietly. Maya tilted her head slightly, waiting, not pressing. He shifted in his chair, leaning just a fraction closer, voice low enough that the rest of the room didn't intrude. "Because if this is a bad investment," he continued, eyes steady on hers, "it's the best one I've made for my heart. Just honesty. Simple, unguarded, and deliberate." For a brief second, something moved across Maya's face. Not surprise, not triumph, just a quiet acknowledgement that landed softly and stayed. She didn't tease him back. She didn't soften the moment. She only held his gaze, then gave the faintest nod. Behind her, a cup clicked against a saucer. Outside, a car rolled past the bridge. Somewhere in the cafe, a page turned. None of it broke what hung between them. And in that ordinary, unremarkable second, the space between Alex and Maya felt warmer than the coffee in his hands. After he spoke, neither of them tried to decorate the moment. Maya returned to her work, yet her movements carried a subtle difference. Not rushed, not nervous, just more aware. Her hands moved with the same steady rhythm, but her attention no longer rested solely on cups and counters. It hovered, quietly, between her and the man by the window. Alex watched her without staring. His eyes followed her path across the room the way someone follows a familiar shoreline, calm, almost absent-minded, yet unmistakably intentional. They did not exchange another meaningful look right away. They didn't need to. Something had shifted, and both of them knew it. When she passed his table again, she placed a small plate of bread beside his cup without asking. He didn't thank her this time. He simply slid it a little closer, a wordless acceptance of what she offered. Later that evening, as she turned the sign on the door to indicate closing time, Alex stood from his chair with no hurry. He gathered his coat, draped it over his arm, and paused, not in hesitation but in acknowledgement. Their eyes met across the room. For a heartbeat, neither moved. There was no confession in that glance. No promises, no declarations, no dramatic pull toward one another. Only recognition. He inclined his head slightly. She gave a small, steady nod in return. Then he walked to the door, the bell chiming softly behind him as he stepped out into the night. Maya watched the door close, just for a second longer than necessary, before turning back to her final tasks. Outside, rain still whispered along the river. Inside, the cafe returned to its quiet order, and between them, unspoken, unclaimed, yet undeniably present, something had begun that neither of them could pretend was ordinary anymore. The cafe settled into its evening rhythm again. Lights warm, voices low, the river moving steadily beyond the glass. If this quiet connection between Alex and Maya is drawing you in, if these small moments are making you lean a little closer, stay with it. The story deepens from here, and every choice, every silence, every glance is about to matter. A simple tap of the like button helps stories like this travel further, and if you want to follow where their path leads, keep watching and stay subscribed. For now, let the image of that night linger. Two people standing at the edge of something real, neither naming it yet, both already feeling it. The restaurant sat just above the bend of the river, its large glass walls offering an unobstructed view of the water moving steadily below. From the outside, it looked restrained rather than grand, clean lines, muted lighting, and an absence of anything that tried too hard to impress. Inside, the space carried a hush that felt deliberate. Tables were spaced far apart, giving every pair of guests their own pocket of air. Low instrumental music drifted through the room, soft enough to be felt more than heard. The clink of cutlery and the quiet murmur of distant conversations never rose above a whisper. Through the glass, the river slid past in slow, dark motion, broken only by faint reflections of the restaurant's lights. Every so often, a ripple would catch and scatter that glow, then settle again into smooth movement. A waiter moved with careful precision between tables, setting down glasses without a sound, leaving menus, retreating just as silently. No one rushed. No one laughed loudly. The entire room seemed to understand that whatever conversations were happening here were not meant to be casual. Alex and Maya's table sat closest to the window. Two chairs faced each other across a small, round table covered in crisp white linen. Their glasses stood untouched. Between them rested a single flickering candle, small, simple, and steady. Beyond the glass, the river continued on, indifferent, carrying its reflections toward a horizon neither of them could see. Inside, the air felt still, as if something important were about to move, and the room itself was waiting. The single candle at the center of the table breathed softly, its flame leaning one way, then the other, as if it too sensed the unease in the air. Wax melted slowly down its side in thin, uneven streams that caught the light before settling into stillness. The glow it cast was intimate rather than bright, a small circle of warmth that wrapped around Alex and Maya while leaving the rest of the room at a respectful distance. Shadows danced lightly across their faces. On Alex, the flicker sharpened the lines at the edge of his jaw and softened his eyes, making him look both stronger and more vulnerable at once. On Maya, it brushed her cheekbones with a gentle shimmer, highlighting the calm steadiness in her expression. The candlelight glinted faintly off their glasses, splitting into tiny reflections that trembled with each subtle movement of the flame. Between them, the table felt smaller than it had when they sat down, the space narrowing not by closeness, but by the weight of what had yet to be spoken. Neither of them reached for their drinks. Neither of them broke the silence. Only the candle moved, a quiet, living thing between two people who were about to change the course of each other's lives. Alex sat perfectly upright, but the stillness in him looked forced rather than natural. His hands rested on the edge of the table, fingers lightly curved, not relaxed, not gripping, hovering somewhere between control and restraint. Every so often, his thumb pressed against the linen, smoothing a crease that wasn't really there. His jaw held a quiet tension, the muscle ticking once before settling again. His gaze stayed on the candle for longer than necessary, following the flicker as though it might give him something to focus on other than the moment he was avoiding. He adjusted his sleeve once, then again, as if the fit of his jacket had suddenly become unbearable. His breath came steady, but shallow, like a man choosing every inhale carefully. Across from him, his reflection shimmered faintly in the glass behind Maya, a doubled image of composure that felt thinner than it looked. In that reflection, the strain was easier to see, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his shoulders sat a fraction too high. He opened his mouth once, stopped, and closed it again. For someone used to speaking in rooms filled with power, silence clearly did not come easily to him tonight, but neither did the words he needed to say. The candle flickered. Alex did not. Maya sat opposite him with the same composed stillness she always carried, but her attention had narrowed. Her fingers rested lightly around the stem of her glass, not gripping, not fidgeting, simply aware. She didn't stare at Alex, yet she never quite looked away either, as if she were reading the air around him rather than his face. The small ease that usually lived in her expression had softened into something quieter. Her eyes moved subtly, from his hands to his breath, to the way his jaw tightened and released. None of it escaped her notice. She did not rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, patient, deliberate, allowing him the space to exist inside his own discomfort. Still, something in her posture shifted, barely enough to be seen. Her shoulders relaxed a fraction, as though preparing, not bracing. When the candle wavered, she glanced at it briefly, then back to him. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and steady, carrying neither accusation nor alarm, only quiet certainty. "You didn't ask me here just for dinner." It wasn't a question meant to corner him. It was a recognition, spoken calmly, without pressure, yet impossible to ignore. Alex's eyes dropped from hers to the candle, then to the tablecloth, as if the words might be easier to say to anything but her face. His fingers stilled against the linen. The room around them continued in its quiet, distant way. A fork touching porcelain, a chair shifting somewhere far off, but at their table, everything narrowed to a single fragile line of air between them. He drew in a breath, slow, deliberate, and released it just as carefully. Maya. The candle flickered once, taller, then lower. His throat moved as he swallowed. Parents, he began again, voice quieter now, stripped of its usual polish, have chosen someone for me to marry. The words did not rush. They did not explode. They landed softly, and that was what made them cut. He did not look up immediately after saying them. His gaze stayed fixed on the small flame, as if watching it might spare him from seeing what his confession had done to the space between them. Across the table, nothing in Maya's posture shattered, nothing tightened, nothing flinched, but the warmth that had always sat quietly in her expression went still, not gone, just held. The candle kept burning. The river kept moving beyond the glass, and in that narrow circle of light, the moment hung between them, irreversible, unmistakable, and quietly devastating. The flame bent again, thin and steady, casting a narrow line of light between them. Maya did not look at the candle. Her eyes stayed on Alex, not sharp, not searching, simply present. Her hand remained wrapped loosely around the stem of her glass. The water inside did not tremble. For a moment she said nothing at all. She let his words sit where they had landed, unchallenged, unsoftened. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same quiet steadiness it always did. No edge, no trembling, no accusation. Do you love her? It was not asked like a test, not like a trap, not like a plea. It was asked the way someone asks a question they genuinely need the answer to, clear, direct, and impossible to dodge. Her gaze did not waver, her expression did not harden, she simply waited. The word arrived without preparation. Alex's breath left him first, a slow, uneven exhale, and then, almost immediately after, the answer followed. No, it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was certain. His eyes finally lifted from the candle to meet hers, and in them was no hesitation, no searching for a softer version of the truth. Whatever he had been uncertain about before, this was not it. The small flame between them leaned slightly, as if reacting to the shift in air, but neither of them moved. Alex's hands loosened on the tablecloth. His shoulders dropped a fraction, not in relief, but in the quiet weight of honesty he could no longer avoid. For a moment he simply held her gaze, unguarded, exposed, and unmistakably clear. Nothing in his expression tried to justify the answer. Nothing tried to excuse it. He had spoken plainly, and in that single unadorned syllable, the center of the table felt narrower, the space between them heavier, and the truth impossible to look away from. Maya did not move. Her gaze remained steady on him, neither softer nor harder, simply anchored, as if she were standing on solid ground while the rest of the room shifted. The candle flickered once, then steadied again, its light resting gently across the table between them. Somewhere beyond the glass, the river slid past in quiet, unbroken motion. She took a slow breath, not for dramatic effect, but as though she were choosing her next words with care. Her fingers loosened slightly around the stem of her glass. The water inside settled, perfectly still. Then why are you doing this? Her voice did not rise. It did not crack. It did not carry anger. It carried clarity. The question did not chase him, corner him, or accuse him. It simply stood there, firm and unavoidable, like a door he now had to walk through. Her eyes stayed on his, open, direct, unflinching, giving him nowhere to hide, yet offering no threat in doing so. The room beyond them continued in its quiet hush. At their table, the space between them tightened, not with drama, but with the simple gravity of a truth that now had to be spoken. Alex's gaze drifted back to the candle, not to avoid her, but because the small flame felt easier to face than the steady certainty in her eyes. His fingers shifted on the table, smoothing the linen again, slower this time. It isn't simple, he began, voice low, stripped of its usual precision. At least, not the way my life is built. My parents didn't just raise me, he continued. They constructed the world I move in, the company, the name, the reputation. Every door I walk through exists because they opened it first. He lifted his eyes briefly, searching her face, not for sympathy, but for understanding. To them, marriage isn't about feeling, he said quietly. It's alignment, alliances, stability, a continuation of everything they've spent decades shaping. His jaw tightened, then released. They believe they're protecting me, he added, almost to himself. Protecting what we've built, protecting the future they planned long before I ever had a say in it. He exhaled slowly. When they presented this arrangement, it wasn't a request. It was framed as responsibility, as the next step I was always meant to take. His hand stilled. I know how it sounds, he said, meeting her gaze again. Like an excuse, but it's the weight I've lived under my entire life. Every decision measured, every move watched, every choice tied to something larger than just me. For a brief moment, something cracked through his composure. Not anger, not defiance, just exhaustion. "I don't love her," he repeated softly. "But saying no feels like tearing at a structure that has held me up since childhood." The candle flickered between them. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for permission. He simply laid the truth on the table, raw, unpolished, and undeniable, and waited for what came next. Maya listened without interrupting, without shifting, without trying to soften what he had just laid out. Her hand remained still around the stem of her glass. Her breathing did not change. If anything moved at all, it was only the candlelight, brushing gently across her face. When he finished, she did not look down. She did not look away. She kept her eyes on him, steady, clear, completely present. Her voice, when it came, was neither loud nor sharp. It carried no bitterness, no accusation, no theatrical weight. It was calm, certain, and quietly firm. "Then you're not choosing them, Alex." She paused, not for effect, but to let the first half land. "You're choosing fear." The words did not strike like a blow. They arrived like something solid being set down. Her expression did not harden. If anything, it softened just a fraction, not in pity, but in clarity. She did not lean forward. She did not raise her voice. She simply held his gaze, allowing him to sit fully with what she had said. Across the table, the candle continued to burn, small and steady, as if nothing in the world had shifted, even though between them everything had. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The candle held its small circle of light, steady and unhurried, its flame leaning only slightly in the still air. Beyond the glass, the river continued its slow passage, completely indifferent to the weight inside the room. Alex did not speak. His hands rested flat against the linen now, fingers motionless, as if even he understood that any gesture might disturb something fragile and final. Maya did not look at the candle, and she did not look away from him. Her expression stayed composed, yet there was a depth in her eyes that hadn't been there a moment before. Not anger, not sadness, simply truth resting in full view. From somewhere across the restaurant came the faint clink of a fork against porcelain. A waiter passed quietly in the distance. None of it touched their table. The space between them felt tighter, quieter, and impossibly still. Not empty, but filled with everything that could no longer be avoided. No one rushed to fill it. No one tried to soften it. They simply sat there, suspended in a silence that said more than any speech ever could. Each of them understanding, without a single word, that something between them had shifted beyond return. Maya was the first to move. Not much, just a slow release of the breath she had been holding, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if the room were not already so still. Her fingers slid away from the glass and came to rest flat on the table. Her posture did not change. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the same quiet steadiness it always had. No trembling, no bitterness, no raised edge. She did not soften her words. She did not decorate them. She did not search for a kinder version. She simply said, "I can't marry a man who won't choose me." The line did not crash into the space between them. It settled there, clear, clean, and final. Her eyes stayed on his, not pleading, not accusing, not asking him to argue. There was no challenge in her expression, only certainty. Alex did not flinch. He did not interrupt. He did not reach across the table. His breath shifted barely, like someone bracing themselves without wanting to show it. Maya's gaze did not waver. In that moment, she was not angry. She was not broken. She was simply firm in something she had clearly known before she ever said it out loud. The candle flickered once, very lightly. Beyond the glass, the river kept moving, and between them, those few simple words drew a line neither of them could pretend they did not see. No glass, no raised voices, no dramatic exit. Only the slow, steady burn of the candle and the steady flow of the river beyond the glass. Alex sat perfectly still, as though any movement might make the moment collapse inward. His face did not twist in anguish, yet something behind his eyes shifted, a subtle retreat, like a door closing without a sound. Maya did not look away from him, but she no longer searched his face either. Her expression had settled into something firm and distant, not cold, just closed in a way that could not be undone. Around them, the restaurant continued in its careful hush. A waiter moved past their table, footsteps so light they were almost lost beneath the music. Somewhere, cutlery touched porcelain. A low murmur of conversation floated from across the room. None of it reached them. Between Alex and Maya, the space felt thinner now, stretched too far to hold anything gentle. The warmth that had once lived there had not exploded. It had simply gone still, like a flame lowered until it no longer gave light. Alex's fingers tightened once against the linen, then loosened again. His jaw worked, but no words came. Maya breathed in slowly, then out, steady and composed, as if she were already learning how to exist in a world where this table, this moment, and this man no longer belonged to her in the same way. Their heartbreak did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, sat between them, and refused to move. The waiter returned once, quietly, and placed the check between them without looking directly at either of their faces. The small white folder landed with a soft, ordinary sound that felt far too normal for what had just happened. Alex reached for it first. His movements were measured, controlled, almost mechanical. He opened the folder, glanced at the number, and slid his card inside without hesitation. There was no discussion, no offer from Maya to split it, no back and forth, just the simple finality of a transaction being closed. He closed the folder and set it back at the edge of the table. Neither of them made a move to stand right away. For a few more seconds they remained exactly as they were, two people seated across from each other, separated by a small candle, a table, and a choice that could not be undone. Then Maya rose. Her chair made the faintest sound as she pushed it back. She straightened her jacket, smoothed her dress once with a quiet, absent gesture, and gathered her small bag from the back of her chair. She did not look at Alex as she stood. She did not touch his hand. She did not say goodbye. She simply turned and walked toward the exit with the same composed pace she carried everywhere, as if the floor beneath her were still steady. The hostess inclined her head politely. The door opened. The candlelight did not follow her outside. Alex remained seated. His eyes stayed on the empty chair across from him for a moment longer than necessary, as though he were waiting for something that would not return. His movements were slower now, heavier, like a man carrying more than just the weight of his coat. He shrugged it onto his shoulders, straightened once, and turned toward the door, but he did not follow the same path Maya had taken. Instead, he moved toward a side corridor that led to a different exit, away from the front of the restaurant, away from the river, away from the place where she had just disappeared. 2 doors, 2 directions, 2 separate steps into a night that would never be the same. Outside, the city continued to breathe. Inside, the candle burned down just a little lower, its small flame leaning gently before settling again, alone at a table meant for 2. His face appeared everywhere, on glossy magazine covers, on financial news tickers, on the towering screens that lined the glass walls of the city's business district. Photographers captured him mid-stride, chin steady, coat tailored, expression unreadable in that carefully composed way powerful men learn to wear. One headline called him the architect of expansion. Another declared him the young titan redefining industry. His name rolled smoothly off anchors' tongues, spoken with admiration, certainty, and expectation all at once. Articles dissected his every move, mergers closed, acquisitions secured, partnerships negotiated with surgical precision. Analysts praised his vision. Commentators spoke about his brilliance. His company's logo glowed against skyscrapers that seemed to scrape the sky. In every image he looked immaculate, polished, controlled, untouchable, and entirely alone. The growth did not slow, it accelerated. New offices opened in cities where the river bent differently and the rain sounded unfamiliar against unfamiliar windows. International contracts poured in. Competitors either partnered with him or quietly stepped aside. Inside the company, his presence shifted the air the moment he entered a room. Executives straightened. Assistants moved faster. Conversations softened into careful professionalism. Alex signed documents that reshaped entire markets, his pen moving with calm efficiency across paper and glass tablets alike. Meetings stretched long into the night, windows dark while city lights glittered far below. His calendar filled itself, flights, presentations, strategy sessions, appearances. To the outside world it looked like unstoppable momentum. Inside it felt like a machine he had built and could no longer step out of. Boardrooms became his natural habitat. Long tables polished to mirror-like shine, screens glowing with data, projections, and figures that meant everything to everyone else in the room. Suits speaking in measured, precise language that left no space for hesitation. Alex sat at the head of the table more often than not. He listened. He calculated. He responded with sharp clarity that made others lean forward in respect. His voice carried authority without needing to rise. Champagne flutes waited in private lounges after major deals. Handshakes sealed agreements. Cameras flashed for official photos. People congratulated him constantly. Brilliant move. You're changing the game. No one does it like you. He accepted every compliment with the same slight nod, the same controlled expression, even as his gaze often drifted toward the nearest window. By every visible measure, Alex Moretti had reached the top. A penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows, luxury cars that arrived exactly when summoned. A personal assistant who anticipated his needs before he voiced them. He attended charity galas in tailored black tie, stood beneath crystal chandeliers, and exchanged polite smiles with influential figures who wanted nothing more than proximity to him. His public image showed him at high-profile events, shaking hands with ministers, cutting ribbons, signing agreements. To anyone watching, he had everything a man could want: power, wealth, status, respect. Not a single photograph captured the way he sometimes stood alone in his apartment at night, glass of untouched whiskey in hand, staring at the city below without really seeing it. In quiet moments, the noise fell away, and so did the performance. He woke in his expansive bed to the soft glow of dawn, the room pristine, the silence almost unbearable. No warmth beside him, no easy conversation waiting in the kitchen, only polished emptiness. Meetings blurred together. Flights felt like moving in circles. Conversations sounded like echoes bouncing off glass walls. He smiled when expected. He answered when spoken to. He moved like a man who had mastered control, yet something inside him felt thinner every day. Sometimes, late at night, he found himself lingering by the window, watching rain streak downward, remembering another place where water moved differently and the air felt warmer. He never said her name out loud, but he thought it more often than he wanted to admit. The woman chosen for him was flawless on paper, elegant, educated, poised in every room she entered. Their families appeared perfectly aligned, power with power, influence with influence. At first they attended events together with effortless composure. Cameras loved them, commentators adored them. They looked like the kind of couple that belonged on magazine covers. But behind closed doors, the connection never arrived. Conversations felt scripted. Laughter sounded polite rather than genuine. Even silence between them felt like a negotiation instead of comfort. Alex noticed it in small things, the way she hesitated before touching his hand, the way he instinctively pulled back before realizing he had done so. Plans were postponed. Dinners grew quieter. Meetings replaced moments that should have been personal. What was meant to strengthen slowly weakened instead. They spoke about business more than anything else, board strategies, charity initiatives, public image, responsibilities that came with their names. Rarely did they speak about dreams, fears, or the kind of quiet truths that make two people truly know each other. When they kissed, it felt careful rather than natural. When they sat together, space always remained between them, not just physically, but emotionally. She respected him. He admired her intelligence. But admiration is not love, and respect is not warmth. At night they slept in the same bed, backs turned, each wrapped in their own silence. Alex often lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the city below, feeling the distance between them like an invisible wall. The end did not come in a dramatic confrontation. No shattered glass, no raised voices, no stormy exits. Instead, it arrived quietly, over a late dinner that tasted of obligation more than connection. They sat across from each other, candles burning low, plates barely touched. She studied him for a long moment, her expression composed but tired. "We both know this isn't working," she said, not cruelly, just honestly. Alex did not argue. He did not defend. He did not pretend. He nodded once. They spoke calmly, like two adults acknowledging a reality neither had created but both could see. By the time dessert arrived, the decision was made. They left the restaurant separately, not in anger, simply in understanding. The following morning, the calls began. His mother's voice, sharp beneath its usual polish, carried disappointment wrapped in authority. His father spoke in measured, clipped tones, not yelling, but colder than Alex had heard in years. To them, the engagement was not just personal, it was strategy, reputation, legacy. A carefully arranged piece of a larger design. They spoke of wasted opportunities, damaged alliances, and public perception. Alex listened in silence. He did not argue. He did not apologize excessively. He simply stood by his decision with a calm that unsettled them more than anger ever could. When the call ended, the penthouse felt even quieter than before. Success still surrounded him. The headlines continued. The deals kept closing. His name remained untouchable in the business world. Yet something inside him had gone even more still. The engagement's end did not bring relief. It did not bring clarity. It only deepened the silence that had already been growing. Late one evening, he stood by his floor-to-ceiling window, city lights shimmering beneath him like distant constellations. He rested his palm against the glass, feeling cold instead of comfort. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to remember rain on a river, warm lights, a small cafe, and a woman who had once seen him without his title. Then he lowered his hand. The city stretched endlessly before him, and in all that vastness, Alex Moretti felt smaller, lonelier, and emptier than at any point in his life. She did not fall apart. There were nights when the quiet pressed too hard, mornings when the weight of everything she had lost sat heavy on her chest before she even opened her eyes. But she never let that stillness become surrender. Instead, she gathered herself slowly, the way someone gathers rain in their hands, carefully, patiently, and with quiet resolve. Maya moved forward not in dramatic leaps, but in steady steps that no one applauded and few noticed. She returned to her studies with a focus that surprised even her. Late nights blurred into early mornings. textbooks open beside cooling mugs of coffee, notes spread across her small kitchen table. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to pull her under, when the simplest problem felt too large to solve, but she met each one with the same quiet determination. She finished what she had started. No celebration, no fanfare, just a soft exhale of completion as she placed her final papers into a folder, closed her laptop, and sat in silence for a moment, letting the reality settle. She had done it. Then came the harder, quieter work, saving. Every tip she earned went into a jar she kept hidden in the back of her cupboard. Every extra dollar was folded carefully and tucked away, never spent unless absolutely necessary. She learned to say no to small indulgences, to unnecessary comforts, to anything that might pull her away from the future she was building brick by brick. She did not complain about it. She did not romanticize it. She simply did it. Some evenings, after long shifts behind the counter of the cafe where she still worked, she would walk along the river and imagine what her own place might look like. Not grand, not flashy, just warm, steady, and alive. Slowly the pieces came together. She found a modest space not far from the water, larger than her old cafe, but still intimate, still tucked away from the noise of the city. The front windows were wide and inviting, sunlight spilling in freely during the day, lantern soft glow drifting outward at night. When she first unlocked the door, the room felt empty, echoing, almost uncertain. She filled it with intention. Wooden shelves rose along the walls, lined with carefully chosen books, well-loved classics, quiet contemporary stories, and volumes that felt like they carried pieces of her own heart within their pages. Small round tables sat near the windows, each paired with mismatched chairs that somehow fit together perfectly. Warm lights hung low from the ceiling, their gentle glow creating pockets of comfort rather than harsh brightness. The counter stretched along one side of the room, polished smooth, worn just enough to feel lived in rather than pristine. A small bell rested above the door, its tone soft and welcoming. The air inside began to carry a familiar, grounding scent, rich coffee blending with the dry, comforting smell of paper and ink. Freshly baked bread added a hint of sweetness, and beneath it all lingered something unnameable, a feeling of home. When the doors finally opened to the public, the space did not try to impress. It simply welcomed. People came in hesitantly at first, drawn by the warm light and quiet promise of the room. They left slower than they had entered, shoulders eased, voices softer, something calmer in their step. Maya moved behind her own counter now, not as an employee but as the heart of the place she had built. Her hands worked with the same steady rhythm she had always carried, but there was a deeper sense of ownership in every movement. Then, just as life had begun to settle into something solid, something unexpected arrived. The triplets came not as a plan, but as a miracle that quietly rewrote everything. There were sleepless nights that stretched into dawn, days that blurred into one another, and moments when Maya felt both overwhelmed and immeasurably grateful in the same breath. Yet even in the chaos, there was beauty. 3 small lives filled her world with sounds she had never known, soft cries, bubbling laughter, the shuffle of tiny feet against the floor. They were alike in many ways, yet entirely their own. The first was shy, eyes wide and observant, taking in the world slowly before deciding how to move within it. He rarely spoke first, but when he did, his words carried surprising depth. He watched everything, the way sunlight shifted across the floor, the way people spoke, the way his mother moved behind the counter, and stored it quietly inside himself. The second was bold, forever curious, never content to sit still. She climbed onto chairs before she could properly balance, reached for books that towered above her, and asked questions that left Maya both laughing and searching for answers. Fear did not slow her, it simply sharpened her excitement. The third carried a thoughtful calm beyond their years. He often sat quietly with a book in his lap, tracing the pictures with his small fingers, gazed distant as though he were already contemplating worlds far beyond his own. When he spoke, it was deliberate, unhurried, and strangely wise. Together, they turned Maya's carefully built routine into a lively, unpredictable rhythm. Mornings began with spilled milk and tangled shoelaces, afternoons with crayons scattered across the cafe's back table and books pulled from shelves with unrestrained enthusiasm. There were tantrums, sticky fingers, and moments when Maya wondered how she would manage everything on her own. But there were also gentle moments. The 3 of them curled against her on a quiet evening, their small breaths rising and falling in unison, laughter echoing through the bookstore as they chased one another between the aisles. Soft mama whispered in the dark when sleep felt distant. The cafe became more than a business. It became their world. Customers grew accustomed to seeing the triplets perched near the counter, coloring furiously or stacking books into imaginative towers. Some came just to watch them, drawn by the warmth of their presence as much as by the coffee. Maya learned to balance motherhood with her work, imperfectly but honestly. There were days she arrived, late, hair pulled back hastily, circles beneath her eyes from another sleepless night. There were evenings when she locked up the cafe with exhaustion heavy in her limbs. Yet every time she turned the key in the door, every time she watched her children laugh beneath the warm lights of the bookstore cafe, she felt something steady beneath the fatigue. Her life was not polished. It was not easy. It did not resemble the glamorous images of success the world celebrated, but it was hers, real, messy, full, and deeply meaningful. As seasons passed, the river outside continued its steady flow, carrying reflections of sunlight, rain, and quiet evenings. Inside, the cafe glowed warmly, filled with books, coffee, and the soft sounds of 3 children growing. Maya stood often behind her counter, hands resting lightly on the wood, eyes taking in everything she had built, not just walls and shelves, but a life shaped by courage, patience, and love. She had not chosen perfection, she had chosen truth, and in that choice she had found something far richer than anything she had ever lost. The meeting had drained him more than he let on. Alex stepped out of the towering glass building with the same composed expression he always wore in public, but the moment the doors slid closed behind him, the weight returned to his shoulders. Traffic moved in steady currents along the street. Voices passed by in fragments. The city carried on as if nothing inside him had shifted at all. Instead of calling his driver, he turned toward the river. His steps slowed as he reached the walkway that ran along the water. The evening air carried a faint chill, brushing against his skin and cutting through the polished layers he wore so carefully every day. He walked without direction, hands resting loosely in his coat pockets, gaze drifting across the dark, moving surface of the river. Lights from the city shimmered in broken lines across the water, bending and stretching as the current carried them away. Without realizing it, his pace changed when he reached the stretch of path where he had once turned toward a small cafe tucked beside the river. Out of habit, his eyes lifted toward the familiar spot. For a heartbeat, he expected to see the warm glow of its windows, the gentle blur of figures inside, the soft invitation that had once pulled him in more nights than he could count. But the old cafe was gone. The space where it had stood looked different, more open, more polished, yet still quiet. For a moment he simply stopped, standing at the edge of the path, breathing out slowly as the realization settled. Then he noticed the light. Not harsh, not flashy, just warm and steady, spilling from large windows a few steps further down. A soft glow that felt familiar in an entirely new way. He turned. A bookstore cafe stood there now, its glass front revealing shelves of books, small tables near the windows, and a gentle hum of life inside. The sight tugged at something deep in his chest before he could stop it. He hesitated only briefly. Then, almost without choosing, he crossed the small stretch of pavement toward the door. His hand rested on the handle for a moment longer than necessary. He pushed it open. A soft bell chimed overhead, light, welcoming, unmistakable. Warmth met him instantly, the scent of coffee, paper, and something comforting he couldn't name. The room felt alive without being loud, filled with quiet movement and low conversation. He stepped inside slowly, eyes scanning the space, and then he saw her. Maya stood behind the counter, calmer than he remembered, steadier, carrying a quiet confidence that sat naturally on her shoulders. The years had softened her features rather than hardening them. Her presence felt brighter, more certain, almost luminous. For a moment, everything else in the room blurred. His gaze moved, almost against his will, toward the small table beside the counter. 3 children sat there, coloring with bright pencils scattered across the surface. Their heads bent close together, completely absorbed in their own small world. His breath caught. He looked back at Maya. She had already seen him. Their eyes met across the room. Time stretched thin between them. No one moved. No one spoke. The cafe continued in its gentle rhythm around them. Cups set down, pages turned, the hiss of milk. But for Alex and Maya, the world narrowed to that single line of space. Then softly she said, "Hello, Alex." His name sounded different on her lips now. Not warmer, not colder, just settled. He swallowed. "Hello, Maya." The words came out quieter than he intended. His eyes flicked back to the children before he could stop himself. He took them in properly now, their small hands, their bent heads, the easy familiarity between them. "They're beautiful," he murmured. She followed his gaze just for a second. "They are," she replied simply. One of the triplets, the bold one, paused mid-color, looking up at him with curious eyes. Maya did not hesitate. She did not soften the moment or dramatize it. She met Alex's gaze once more, then answered calmly. An old friend, the words landed quietly, and yet they struck him with unexpected force. His chest tightened, not in anger, not in protest, but in a slow, undeniable understanding. There was no hostility in her tone, no bitterness, just distance that had been earned rather than imposed. He felt it fully in that instant. He shifted his weight, suddenly unsure of himself in a way he hadn't been in years. "May I sit with you?" he asked carefully, not assuming, not pushing, simply asking. Maya studied him briefly, not with suspicion, just consideration. Then she gave a small nod. He crossed the room slowly, pulling out the chair opposite her and lowering himself into it. The movement felt strangely fragile for a man used to commanding entire rooms. For a few moments they sat in quiet, the children coloring beside them, the cafe breathing around them. Alex's gaze drifted to the triplets again. One of them looked up at him shyly, then quickly returned to their drawing. Another flashed him a quick, fearless grin before turning back to their paper. He cleared his throat. "May I hold one of them, if it's okay?" Maya watched him, then looked at the children. The shy one glanced up, hesitant, then nodded almost imperceptibly. She shifted slightly, lifting the child and placing them gently in Alex's arms. He accepted them with trembling care. His hands shook, not dramatically, just enough to reveal the depth of what he was feeling. He adjusted his hold slowly, protectively, as if the small life against his chest were something sacred. For a moment, the polished world he lived in fell away completely. No titles, no power, no money, no legacy. Just a man holding a child, breathing carefully, eyes soft in a way very few people had ever seen. He looked down, unable to tear his gaze away. The child watched him curiously, then rested their head lightly against his shoulder, as if sensing his need for that closeness. Silence settled between him and Maya again, not awkward, not cold, just honest. Finally he spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "I thought, if I followed my parents' path, everything would work out." Maya did not rush to answer. She rested her hands lightly on the edge of the table, eyes steady on him. "And did it?" she asked calmly. A sad, almost rueful smile touched his lips. "No." He looked around the cafe, slowly, at the books, the warm lights, the children's drawings pinned to a small board near the counter, then back at her. "You built something beautiful here," he said quietly. She met his gaze without hesitation. "I built something honest." There was no judgment in her tone, only quiet truth. Alex nodded, absorbing the weight of her words. They spoke gently after that. Not about the past in detail, not about blame, not about what might have been. Just about small things, how the cafe had grown, how the children liked the river, how life had shifted in ways neither of them could have predicted. Maya listened when he spoke, not with pity, not with bitterness, simply presence. When he finished, she did not offer forgiveness or condemnation. She simply stayed steady. After a while, Alex carefully shifted the child back into Maya's arms. She accepted them smoothly, cradling them with practiced ease. He stood slowly, smoothing his coat without really thinking about it. At the door, he paused. He did not beg. He did not plead. He did not try to insert himself into her life where he no longer belonged. Instead, he turned back once more. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me see this." Maya offered him a gentle, unforced smile. "Thank you for finally being honest." For a second, their eyes held, not as they once had, but with something quieter, older, and more settled. Then he stepped outside. The bell chimed softly behind him. The river moved steadily beside the cafe, carrying reflections of fading light toward the horizon. Alex walked along its edge, hands in his pockets, breath slow, heart heavy but clearer than it had been in years. Inside, the bookstore cafe glowed warm and alive, filled with books, coffee, and 3 children who belonged there completely. Outside, Alex continued down the path, no longer looking back. And if this reunion has pulled at you the way it pulled at him, if this quiet moment between 2 lives shaped by different choices touched something in you, stay with the story and consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Because the end of this tale is not loud, it is gentle, and it matters. The evening softened around him as he stepped back onto the riverside path. The door of the bookstore cafe closed with a gentle click, the small bell's chime already dissolving into the air. Warm light still spilled from the windows, painting a quiet rectangle across the wet pavement before fading into the dusk. Alex did not rush. He did not linger. His footsteps fell at a measured pace that matched the slow movement of the river beside him. The city was quieter here, farther from the glass towers that defined his life. Cars passed in distant murmurs, their headlights stretching in thin lines across the water. Somewhere a boat drifted slowly downstream, its wake breaking the surface into subtle widening rings. He walked until the cafe became a small glow behind him. Then he stopped. The sky above the river had begun to change, not in spectacle but in steady transition. Gold softened into amber, amber deepened into rose, and the clouds stretched thin, carrying those colors across the horizon like something brushed there by a careful hand. The water mirrored it all. Light rippled gently along the surface, bending and breaking into countless fragments that slid together again without struggle. The river did not hurry toward night. It carried the fading day with quiet patience. Alex rested his hands on the railing that bordered the path, palms flat against the cool metal. The chill traveled up his arms, grounding him in the present rather than the past. He thought of many things, not in a rush, not in a storm, but in slow, passing impressions. He thought of the first time he had walked into that small cafe years ago, rain on his coat and exhaustion in his bones. He thought of Maya's steady voice, the warmth of a mug placed in front of him without ceremony, the way she had never looked at him like a title. He thought of the dinner by the river, candlelight between them, the moment the truth had landed, and the quiet strength in her words that night. He thought of boardrooms and headlines, of applause that never filled the space inside him, of an engagement that had looked perfect and felt empty. And he thought of what he had just seen, shelves of books glowing softly, children laughing beneath warm lights, a life built with intention rather than pressure. None of it came with bitterness. None of it came with regret that demanded vengeance or reversal. It arrived instead as understanding, clear, steady, and undeniable. He turned once briefly and looked back toward the bookstore cafe. Through the glass he could see movement. Maya behind the counter, one of the triplets perched beside her, another stacking books in careful piles, the third bent over a sheet of paper, crayon in hand. For a heartbeat, the scene looked like something he might have stepped into rather than observed. Then the light shifted, and the image softened. Alex straightened slowly. His breath left him in a measured exhale. He did not imagine a different ending. He did not rewrite the past. He did not picture himself crossing back over that threshold. He simply accepted what stood before him, real, honest, complete. As the sun dipped lower, the sky deepened into darker shades of purple and blue. The last rim of light clung to the horizon before slipping away, leaving the river to carry a softer, quieter glow. Street lamps flickered to life along the path, their reflections trembling across the water in delicate, wavering lines. Alex began walking again, not toward the cafe, not toward the city's brightest lights, just forward. Steady, composed, present, his coat shifted lightly with each step. The night air brushed his face, cool and clean. Somewhere in the distance, laughter echoed faintly, carried across the water and lost again in the gentle rhythm of the river. When he reached the next bend, he paused one last time. The bookstore cafe was no longer visible. Only the river stretched ahead, dark now, steady, endless. He let his gaze rest there, and in that quiet, unadorned moment, the truth settled fully, not as punishment, not as defeat, but as clarity he could finally carry without resistance. Some people don't lose love because it fades. They lose it because they were not brave enough to protect it. If this story stayed with you, even after the lights dimmed and the river went still, let it travel a little farther. Like if it touched you. Comment your thoughts if it made you reflect. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe to Mr. Cooper's Stories for more narratives that linger long after the final line.